I'm talking. Perfect. I chose the topic of this webinar essentially after I realized I was going to be presenting, or that the date that for the presentation was so close to the start of the school year. And so I sort of thought, you know, we have such a wonderful opportunity at the beginning of the year to kind of set the tone, right? To create the culture that we're going to live with in our classroom for the rest of the semester or the year. You know, we were joking, it's kind of hard to make big changes to that culture in November, right? We really have to take advantage of the opportunity we have in the beginning to establish sort of expectations. So that's why I chose this topic. And in some ways, it's just a collection of a bunch of different ideas, more so than other types of presentations, I guess. But thank you for joining. So a little bit more about me besides the bio. These are some photos from my 15 years as a high school Spanish teacher, but you'll see I have a photo in the top corner with former student Brenda Lopez, who was a high school student of mine, then a colleague of mine as a Spanish teacher, and whose master's thesis I am now supervising at UNK. So she has been with me in my sort of entire professional journey. But then I have two classroom photos too. One of a group of students who were the recipients of a creative writing award in Spanish from the University of Nebraska, Omaha. And the other is a group of students acting out a skit in my language classroom at Lincoln High. So I taught for 15 years in public secondary schools, first in Florida at a charter school, then in Crete, Nebraska for 8 years, and 5 years at Lincoln High School, where I ended my public school teaching career before coming to the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, where I coordinate our graduate program for language teachers, and so get to teach graduate courses in pedagogy, in curriculum assessment for teachers. So I'm speaking here from my experience as a classroom teacher. And so I'm hoping to share with you some really practical strategies or sort of practices for the classroom that you can use to set the tone, basically. So I have one objective, and I said, that's right, just one. We're going to know, understand, and be able to use some simple classroom practices and routines that communicate a culture of high expectations for engagement and participation, really in any language classroom. So this is not a language or level specific conversation. So that is our objective. And of course, as you all likely know, setting those objectives is one way, right, that we can start to establish a culture of high expectations for engagement. There is a folder. I'm going to go ahead and, if I escape for a second, and paste that link for you in the chat. You will get a folder that has this presentation in it, for one. So let's see, find my chat. Where's my chat? Not showing it for me. Show chat. Where? Crystal, can you post the link in the chat? My chat is not popping up because I'm screen sharing. Oh, there we go. Not to Crystal, to everyone. There we go. We both succeeded at the same time. So in that folder is the presentation and a bunch of other sort of files that I'm going to mention, or resources. So I'll kind of indicate to you when I'm talking about something that's in the folder for you to either look at now or maybe later, right? But first off, if you have that chat box open now, can you sort of give me an idea? Let's like visualize. What does a classroom with a culture of high expectations for engagement and participation look like? Like, what is happening in a classroom where that is what's happening? Where there is a culture of high expectations for engagement and participation. What are we seeing students do? What are we seeing the teacher do? Write me some ideas in the chat. Okay, Tim says students are talking. All right, here we go. Having fun. I like that. On task. I like that too. Students are eager to participate. So you can sort of feel, right? There's like an emotional part of that, right? How students are feeling, students discussing, teacher observing. I like the idea of the teacher as facilitator, maybe in that classroom. The teacher's expectations are clear. Students know the teacher's expectations. I like that too, right? That students seem to know what they're doing, right? Feel confident. That's another part of it, right? Lots of students using the target language, being on task. I love it. So I think we're kind of, we have a shared vision, right, of what it looks like to successfully create a classroom culture where there are high expectations for engagement and participation. You know, one key part of that is that we're seeing those kinds of behaviors from all students, right? Not just the few students who come to us already eager to participate, but that we're seeing those engagement behaviors from all students. And of course, being on task, that kind of thing. So keeping that in our mind, try to connect what we're talking about here with that vision for the classroom that we're trying to create. So I have like kind of 3 big ideas here, and I'm going to talk through some strategies that are associated with those big ideas. The first one here is around crafting behavioral expectations. So something we do, and especially with novice learners, right? Especially with younger learners, we probably dedicate a good portion of the early part of our contact to establishing expectations for behavior, teaching routines in the classroom, right? And if we're not doing that, we probably should be doing that. My big idea I want to share with you here is crafting those expectations about behavior and really everything else in the classroom in terms of language learning. And what that implies is that we teach learners about how languages are learned. What is it that a teacher has to do in order for them to learn language? What is it that they as the student need to do in order to learn language? And we're going to craft some behavioral expectations around those things, right? You can expect from me that I'm going to do this because that's what you need to do to learn. And I'm going to expect you to do this because that's what you need to do to learn. The other thing is, right, we should help students craft a sort of understanding of what the proficiency target in the course is and what they should be able to do with the language if they're successful in the course, right? So students have a sense of how much language learning we're expecting to happen and what it will look like to perform successfully. So in the folder, there's a PowerPoint presentation that actually was made into a Pear Deck at one point that I created many years ago to teach students in Spanish 1 and Spanish 2 at the beginning of the year a little bit about language acquisition. And so what I teach students is that there are 3 parts to language learning. You need input, you need to produce output, and you need to have interaction, right? Because you need to have input, as we all know, comprehensible input. In order to learn language, you need to make output, or at least most of us agree that you need output, and that you need to have interaction and negotiation of meaning, right? So we teach students about what those things mean and then tell them, right, that it's our responsibility to speak to them in the target language because they need that input to learn, right? And that it's my responsibility to make that input comprehensible to you. And I'm going to do that in these ways. I'm going to do it with pictures. I'm going to do it with gestures. I'm going to do it with my facial expressions, and I'm going to repeat, and I'm going to do all of these things to help you access that input, right? But we also talk about what does it mean for students then? It means you need to pay attention and you need to try to understand. It means you need to ask clarification questions when you don't understand. So we're setting expectations for behavior of what students need to be doing in class around the idea of what it takes to be successful language learning. And so the reason I need you to pay attention isn't because I sort of am arbitrarily seeking control, right? Or that it's because I'm the boss or because I'm the teacher and you're the students. No, it's because these are the behaviors I need from you in order for me to do my job, right? Which is to fulfill my responsibility to help you learn language, right? And so then when we have to redirect students' behaviors, we can do that back to the language learning behaviors. So if we say, I need you to get out your piece of paper and take these notes, or I need you to start working this, or I need you to speak in the target language when you're talking to your partner, because you need interaction in order to learn language, right? Because you need to get this input in order to learn. And it's my responsibility to give you that input and to give you this opportunity to interact, to learn. So I think it changes the nature of those kind of behavioral redirections when we continually return to the idea of the behaviors that we need in order to learn language, as opposed to the behaviors that I'm sort of arbitrarily asking from you because I'm mean, or I'm trying to thwart the fun that you're having, or all of those other reasons why students resent our kind of redirections to more appropriate behavior. Also in the folder are some example syllabus statements that I give to my students in my online Spanish 200 course that also talk about what it means in those syllabus statements, which might be something that you'd find it helpful when you produce a document about classroom expectations for parents and those kinds of things that explain a little bit about how you learn how language is learned and what that means for what we're going to be doing in the classroom. And I think this is a really nice way to start your early contact with students, is helping them anticipate what class will be like and explaining why we're doing the things that we're doing and why you need students to behave in certain ways, right? So it's kind of the start of what that big idea is. I want to share with you basically my basketball metaphor, and this is in no way original, and I'm not necessarily a huge fan of sports metaphors, but I feel like this really is explanatory for students and parents. I don't know if you've had the experiences that I've had where parents come and they say, my student in level 2 of the language, I put on the Spanish radio station and he didn't understand anything. Aren't you teaching them anything, right? That helping parents and students have realistic expectations for what students can learn or are going to learn in a certain amount of time in a class is really useful. But helping students understand that learning a language is perhaps not like their other content area courses, that what you have to do to learn language is not the same as what you have to do to learn biology or what you have to do to learn algebra. In some ways it's similar, but in other ways it's very much not. And so I like to say that learning a language is like playing basketball, because what you need to do to become a really good basketball player is a lot like what you need to do to learn language. So you can tell students, right? It might be helpful to know the rules of basketball to become a good basketball player, but that is certainly not the most important part, and certainly not a sufficient condition, right? Doing some drills like dribbling or running, right, might help you become a better basketball player, but they are definitely not a sufficient condition either, right? If you want to become a really good basketball player, you're going to need to play basketball. Often, a lot, right? For real. And you're going to need to sort of reflect on that performance, talk about how it went, right? You're also going to need to acknowledge that playing a lot of basketball for 6 hours on Friday night is just not the same as playing basketball for an hour every day of the week, right? In terms of the quality of the practice. There's quantity and then there's the nature of the practice. And how long will it take to become a really good basketball player? I think we have an understanding, student athletes and students who are familiar with the idea of athletic competition understand how long it takes to become really good at something like that. So setting realistic expectations about how much progress we expect to see. And to also acknowledge that there might be individual differences. Some people might learn to be good at basketball faster than other people, but everyone gets better with practice and everyone can play, right? So I think that this is a helpful way to understand what kind of behaviors you need to do in order to learn language. We have to have communicative practice. So we have to speak in the target language. You have to speak in the target language. I have to speak in the target language. We have to interact with each other in order to become good language learners, to become good language speakers. And so I think I find that really a helpful metaphor for helping students understand why we're doing the things that we're doing in our classroom. So the next kind of big idea here is kind of obvious, right? That successful performance leads to greater motivation, right? And I think you can just apply this to your sort of regular life and say, you know, when we think we're good at something, like we're improving or we're very likely to succeed, or maybe we have some talent, we are more likely to try. We're more willing to take a risk if we believe that our performance will be successful, right? Most of us are pretty averse to trying something, especially a public performance, where we think we will fail. Yeah? And this goes the same for students who are learners. So the big kind of question here is, how do we make language learning experiences successful for students so we can create that cycle of successful performance and motivation, right? I try, I succeed, and that prompts me to be willing to try more, right? So we want to ensure that students make the effort. So we set up structures where it's easy to try, right? It's easy to attempt. We scaffold to support their performance. So we help them be successful. Then we praise their effort, their attempt, as well as the results, connecting how their trying, right, led to the successful performance. I think that's kind of a intuitive nature, you know, I mean, it's an intuitive understanding of how motivation happens through successful performance. And we can certainly relate in other aspects of our own lives. It's very frustrating when you fail at something to want to keep trying to do it. But what does that look like in the classroom? So I want to share kind of a really concrete way in which we make this happen during something that we do often. So whole class instruction with teacher questions is just a regular part of language learning classroom. We're providing input and we call on students, right? We ask students questions to check for understanding, to ask them to produce output. But this is something we do often, especially if we're, you know, sort of doing comprehensible input, or if you like to do circling with students to create repetition of structures. But these kind of 3 strategies came from the book Teach Like a Champion, which, and I give the first 3 chapters of this book to sort of every student teacher I've ever hosted, and they contain these 3 strategies for that whole class performance that are really tied to establishing high expectations for participation. So the first one is to cold call students rather than take volunteers. And I know people always are sort of prickled by this, that they don't want to embarrass students, or they don't, you know, they don't think that that's fair, or let me try to convince you that it is, right? When we ask a question and no one knows who will be called on to answer, we are all anticipating it could be us. And so instead of one person thinking about the answer, everyone, right? And we're going to be training students through this behavior. When I ask a question, everyone is thinking about the answer, even if ultimately only 1 or 2 people will actually reply to it. I'm ensuring more of the class is paying attention to the input because they're anticipating being called on. But if we call on students with the purpose of motivating participation rather than punishing or embarrassing students, like I am guilty of this, and I'm sure we all are, to call on the student who is obviously not paying attention in order to point out to him or her that they are not paying attention, right? That using that call on as a behavior redirect, which essentially is for the purpose of kind of punishing and embarrassing the student, we're not cold calling for that purpose. And we're not cold calling randomly. So I'm not advocating like the popsicle stick method where we just sort of randomly call on students. I am advocating cold calling strategically based on what we know about learners with the goal of creating successful performance. So I take my questions and I say, the question that I'm asking, who do I think can give me a successful response to this question, right? Or that this question might be within their zone of proximal development, that maybe with a little help they can answer this question. Our goal, right, is that the student successfully answer the question, not that they unsuccessfully answer the question. So we cold call so that everyone thinks about the question, and then we call on a student who can give the answer that helps everyone confirm what they were thinking, right? The right answer, yeah? With that cold calling, inevitably, we'll have students who say, I don't know, right? Or give us an incorrect answer. And what we do next is sort of the second strategy here, right? The Teach Like a Champion folks call this no opt out, but we call on the student, we ask them the question in the target language, and every time we call on a student, the interaction should end with the student giving the successful response. So when someone says, I don't know, or they give a wrong answer, we don't move on. We stay with the student and continue questioning until we can get a right answer. And there's several ways we can do that. As you know, right, we can ask the question, they give us the wrong answer, we say, not quite. Is it A or B? We can offer the choice question. Is it A or is it B? We can ask them, we can prompt them, giving them a sort of follow-up question to help them get closer if we think they can answer that. If we really have a student who's sort of refusing to participate or really can't answer, we could go to a peer who we know has the answer, ask, what's the answer? But then come back to the student and ask them the question again, letting them use the answer provided by the other student. Yeah, and we say, thank that other student for your help, for your assistance, but make sure that the successful performance comes from the student who originally said, I didn't know at the end. And then we praise them, right? We say, thank you, great job, I appreciate you giving me the answer, etc. Right? But students quickly learn that I don't know doesn't get you off the hook, and a wrong answer doesn't get you off the hook. And this is another way that kind of further supports the cold calling practice, and everyone listening, being attentive to the input and anticipating being called on to engage with the teacher, right? The last one of these kind of three strategies, they call right is right and stretch it. And I'm going to connect that with some ideas in language learning here in just a second. But what they say is that I initiate an interaction with a student and I should push one for the highest quality answer, the answer I really want, not an answer that's sort of so-so or partially right, or in the case of our language learners, like one word when I really want the phrase, or I want a whole sentence, or I want elaboration, and to stay with the student and continue to question until we get the right is right, the actual answer that we're hoping for, if we want complete sentences, if we want full phrases. And then following up when we can, or when it makes sense, to sort of stretch that with a follow-up question to get more from students, to get elaboration. So we're getting more from students every time. And when we do these sort of three things, we start to create a culture of engagement when we're in those whole group questioning situations, which are times that we often lose students, especially in a large group, to off-task behavior. If we really start to hold students accountable for paying attention to what's happening, attending to the input from the teacher, and raising the expectations for the quality of responses that we get from students, you'll notice there's a huge difference in terms of the attentiveness to the input that you're getting from students in those whole group things. So this last one, right is right and stretch it, is connected to kind of an idea from, if you're familiar with the high leverage teaching practices from ACTFL, one of them is the establishing a discourse community in the classroom, right? It's engaging students in conversations in a discourse community. And they talk about, so this manual, Enacting the Work of Language Instruction, sort of explores those high leverage teaching practices. And one of the high leverage teaching practices, or sort of sub practices that they identify, is this moving toward IRF rather than IRE teacher-student interactions. So the classic teacher-student interaction is what's called an IRE. The teacher initiates a question, the student responds, and then the teacher provides an evaluative comment like, very good, correct, right, excellent. I say, muy bien. This is the normal, and what does is that puts the end to the interaction, right? I ask the student, what color is your backpack? They say green. I say muy bien. End of our interaction, right? Pushing more of our student interactions, and I'm talking about all the time, whether we're working one-on-one with students, whether we're simply chatting in the target language, relationship building at the beginning of class or after class in the target language, that we push toward IRF interactions. We ask a question, the student responds, and we follow up. One, in a way that's sort of naturally communicative, not in an artificially. So I say, what color is your backpack? The student says green. I don't say, what color are your shoes? That's a weird and artificial conversation, right? But I say, what color is your backpack? Green, because we're practicing colors. I say, I love it. Is it new? Yeah. Oh, yes, it is. Oh, it looks like you can put a lot of things in it. What's in it right now? What do you have in your backpack? And so we're pushing students to engage in a communicative interaction that extends beyond, right, that just one word response and then the teacher evaluation. We're getting more from students with each of those interactions. And when students anticipate that that's going to happen, that I'm going to ask them follow-up questions, what happens is they start to give you more information the first time, right? So when students realize that every time the teacher asks me a question, it's not just one question, they're going to follow up with more. I start to give more in the first place, right? Anticipating that those kind of questions are going to come. And really what you can do then is use those follow-up questions to push for the proficiency target for your student, right? If we're working with students in the novice low to mid range, that we're pushing for words and phrases. So at some point, we're going to stop saying one word is enough, right? One word isn't enough. We need a phrase, and we push for that phrase. As students move to novice high, we push for complete sentences, and we remind students with our follow-up or our response to push, right, for the full sentence. And when you continually ask students and you sort of don't accept those simple one-word responses and you prompt for more, students will start to give you more, right? That you've created the expectation that that's the level of performance that we need to give when the teacher calls on me to answer a question or when the teacher asks me a question. And so when you hold students accountable for giving you that, and with support, right, you ask follow-up questions until you get that performance, you're setting a standard for what interaction looks like in the classroom in the target language. And I think you'll find this is a really sort of simple thing to do if you kind of keep it present in the classroom, and you'll notice right away how it changes interactions, the nature of your interactions with students. So I'm a big fan of I'm a big fan of this cold calling, no opt out, right is right thing. And I think especially for novice educators, learning to do this can really, really help you establish a culture of high expectations. Quickly, when we come to students who don't answer a question or answer with, I don't know, or kind of give us, kind of meh answers, and we let them off the hook, right away, other students pick up on that kind of thing. So it's in terms of setting expectations, it's something can really be effective with just a subtle change to what you're doing in a very simple, everyday classroom interaction. So I'm going to stop for a second. Thoughts, questions, reactions. Do you do this? Do you not do this? In the chat or raise your hand. What are your thoughts about, do you cold call students? What are you thinking, or what are some of your strategies as you engage students in that whole group or kind of questioning situations? You can chat or hand raise, or if everyone's just listening and like eating breakfast, that's okay too.
Hi, Janet.
Hey.
Can you hear me?
I can.
I guess you can. Actually, I'll put on my video here in my living room. Howdy. Thanks so far for the presentation. It's awesome. I do cold call. I'm 100% behind these strategies. to keep students on their toes, and definitely to stretch out the conversation with follow-up questions. I think this ties in a lot to providing them comprehensible input to keep those little phrases being heard by the students as we give them logical questions to keep them talking, and not to kind of go too much into another sports motif. But one of the techniques I do to kind of encourage more interaction than less, and to pull more out of them when they're in their small groups, at whatever level they might be. I encourage a practice called verbal volleyball or conversational volleyball, by which they try to keep the conversation going. And this can work just on interpersonal communication at any level and in any languages, but what other questions can you ask your partner to keep the conversation going, keep that ball in the air? You know, how many back and forth exchanges can you have, including reactions? And this gives you an opportunity to give them kind of reactive phrases. Oh my God, really? You got to be kidding me. All these kind of conversational nuggets that they're eventually going to want to employ in their communication.
I love that. I love that. I like the idea of sort of challenging them to say, like, how many times can you go back and forth without sort of radically changing the topic, kind of stuff. I like that. Yeah. I see Gabby just put something in the chat here. Cold calling was really difficult at first because students sort of forgot how to talk to each other in person. Yeah. So he said they were afraid to talk, but not afraid to write. Yeah. You said this year is so different. Oh yeah, I am sure that this year for everyone, the energy in classrooms, I think, will be so much different compared to what we were dealing with in the pandemic. Absolutely. And I like, Gabby, as a scaffold there, that idea of having students sometimes write things down before, right, we call on students, especially if we're asking sort of challenging questions, right? If we're asking questions that that students need to perhaps have more wait time than your normal question wait time, to write before you call on someone is a great idea too. I hope everybody loves my photo of this student here. I thought that this student sort of embodied the look of students, you know, who are like reluctantly called on in your class. But what happens is when you really insist, right? If you really insist on students answering your questions, they stop resisting, because it's easier to just answer the question than to have the teacher continually sort of continue to ask you questions until you answer. That they quickly realize it's much easier to just answer the question in the first place. And that's our goal, right? Is communicating that I'm just not going to take less than the answer that I'm looking for, right? That we're going to stick with you until I get from you what it is that I wanted in the first place. Okay, so I'm going to move on from here a little bit. So speaking of kind of student to student interaction, I love that Tim kind of brought up the volleyball idea here. I'm going to suggest also, in terms of establishing a culture, and I'm really thinking about at the beginning of the year, right? As we're sort of setting the tone for what's going to happen in our classroom, is that we should probably choose and really teach a very limited number of cooperative learning structures. And I'm not advocating for any in particular. Okay, that's my dog's barking. That if we choose a kind of limited number of cooperative learning strategies and use them kind of repetitively, teaching students how these strategies work before we kind of go for the novelty, right? Novelty is one way that we create engagement, by having sort of a different thing to do every day. But I would sort of suggest the opposite at the beginning of the semester, and really focus on developing really quality performance in some interactive cooperative learning structures using them repetitively and really giving students instruction and feedback on how they work. And then we can loosen them up later and we can do variations of them and we can introduce novelty. But really in those first couple months of the school year, to sort of focus on teaching students how we do these cooperative learning structures. So here's 4 of the ones that I really like. And in the folder, there is a document where I kind of describe in more detail kind of what procedures I'm teaching students. But one, of course, is the think or write pair share, right? Which everybody uses probably every day in the language classroom, or that we can use every day if we want to. And I start by teaching that in a really structured, sort of timed way, where we say, okay, you know, I ask the question, I maybe even give it a model response, and I say, you think you have 2 minutes, set the timer, right? When that's up, I say, okay, who's your partner? Your elbow partner, point to your partner. Everybody knows who your partner is. Okay, look at your partner. Who's partner A? Who's partner B? Partner B raises their, you say, partner B, raise your hand. And all the partner Bs raise their hand. And you say, partner A goes first, right? Which always gets a good laugh. But you time the amount for the interaction. Saying who goes first sort of prevents any awkwardness, right? So you say, all right, 1, 2, 3, person A shares now. Setting a timer, right? Person A shares, when person E is done, person B shares. And then, you know, when that time is up, we call on some individual groups to share maybe what their partner had said. So we're asking for what they heard from their partner. And teaching that structure, right? Where that's how we're going to do it, and using the timer and saying who's going to go first, it makes that interaction really efficient. And then as students sort of start to understand, when I say we're going to do think, pair, share, this is what we're going to do. Later in the semester, I'd say, forget the timer, forget saying who goes first, because we're all comfortable and we know how to successfully participate in the interaction, right? We know how to do it. Another one that I always use are pair info gaps, right? So we all know an info gap where student A has some information that student B doesn't have, and student B has some information student A doesn't have, and then they have to interact to do this. I love to do this on clipboard. So I hand out the clipboard for student B and the clipboard for student A. And sometimes I even have them stand up. So all the students who are student A are facing this part of the room, and all the students who are student B are facing that point. And I make a big theater about, you know, this is a super secret document, super secreto. Do not turn it around, right? This is your super secret, yours. You can't share it with your partner. It makes it easier when they're standing and have a clipboard for me to monitor that we're not doing things like, here, just see my answers, right? Like, here, I'll just put my paper on the desk so you can just kind of copy, and then I don't have to speak the target language. That I find using those clipboards and having students really positioned so I can see that we're protecting our super secret document. And then we're teaching students, right, about how it's super secret and how you have to hold it up and how you, and we model how that interaction works. And then we praise students, right, for doing it successfully. We say, you've done such an awesome job. You did such a good job in negotiating meaning there. I heard you asking great questions, all of those kind of things. Another 2 structures that I use a lot are small, like 3-person groups where there's a defined role. I like the number 3 because it's easy to come up with a real role without having to like make up weird roles that are sort of imaginary roles when you have a group of 5 and you're like, well, what's the 5th person going to do? And we start to kind of invent silly roles. But with 3, we can kind of make sure that there's some interaction, not too many, everybody's going to do some work. With readings, like to have somebody who maybe reads out loud, somebody who asks questions to the group about them understanding after every paragraph, somebody who writes down the group's answers or reflections, that kind of thing. But teaching students about the roles and having students have opportunities to play the different roles at different moments and giving feedback around how well the roles were played, like saying, oh, questioners, I heard you do such a good job asking questions in our reading groups today. Nice work with your questions. Next time, remember to have the readers pause after each paragraph so we can make sure everyone's understanding. That we give feedback on the process of doing the cooperative learning structure so that students are progressively better understanding what it means to successfully participate in those learning structures. The last one I really like is gallery style presentations. I've basically stopped having single students present to a large group, and in favor of doing a gallery style presentation where half the class is presenting to one other member of the class who is their audience, and the presenter presents several different times as the audience members cycle through those different presenters. And teaching students how that gallery style presentation works can be terrific, because you can do an informal presentation all the time. Students might be doing some writing, or maybe we even have sort of images, and we could say, okay, all right, everybody hop up, gallery style presentation for some presentational communication practice. You know, half of us stand against the wall here, somebody go stand in front as the audience member, take 2 minutes and tell them about what you've written so far. Tell them about the image that you've chosen, or tell them about the article that you've been reading. And then repeat. And so the lovely thing about that is students get repetition, and that you can hear without making anybody nervous and without boring the crap out of everybody who's listening to the individual students giving whole class presentations, in a large class especially. But if you kind of, you know, I'm not necessarily saying these are the cooperative learning structures that you need to use or anything like that, but to sort of hunker down and choose what are the structures that you're really going to spend time teaching, so that you can use them really efficiently and effectively, and so that you can give students a successful student interaction performance, right, as soon as you can in the semester. So we say, look, you spoke the target language with your peers and you did great, right? You did an excellent job, because success breeds motivation, right? If turning to your partner and sharing what you thought about or what you wrote was like easy to do, right? The teacher made it very easy for me to do. We timed it. She told me who would go first, you know, and it all worked. I'm more likely to do it again, right? I'm more likely to attempt. And I did that gallery style presentation and it wasn't scary, right? And I'm going to be more willing to do increasingly more complicated, increasingly larger, increasingly more elaborate things, because I feel confident in my ability to do it successfully. And so if we want to get student to student interaction in the target language, we set up structures where they can do it without a lot of risk and be very successful doing it and be acknowledged for that success, right? Because that motivation comes from that successful performance. Other sort of general ways we can help students have successful performances, engaging with reading or writing. I really like to teach students strategies for these tasks using modeling and think alouds. So we can talk students through, if we're going to say, read an authentic source, we can model for students. We sort of project that and we say, okay, you know, class, what do you think we should do first when we start to read here, right? Oh, maybe we should kind of scan the titles and the subheadings and make some predictions. Yeah. Let's start reading the first paragraph. What do you think I should do? I just don't know what this word is. What do you think I should do? What do you think it could mean, right? So we're modeling some of the strategies and kind of explicitly then teaching them. So what are some things we need to do while we're reading this text? The same thing goes for student writing, right? I can do a model response to a writing prompt with students helping me co-construct that writing, right? Well, if I have to answer this, how do you think I would start? What would be the most important part to start? What do you think I should say next? Do you think I should add more? How would I ask a question? And having students, showing students what it's like to successfully engage in the task is going to give them a lot of confidence when they go to do it themselves, right? And that's a sort of simple, and I'm sure most of you already know, right, that modeling instructions, showing students, especially when we give instructions in the target language, to then model, right, what students are supposed to do, really increases the chance of success of students in performing the task successfully if they see me do it. They see me do it first. So that's another idea that kind of relates to that. And then we create a successful performance, right? Students then read the text. They've successfully read the text. I've helped them. And we say, look at everything you were able to understand there, right? Like you should be really proud of yourself. Look at all of that target language text and look at everything that you were able, all of the meaning you were able to make from that, right? Especially with novice learners who are really intimidated by target language texts. So when we celebrate how much they're able to understand, we can motivate them to do more. And I think modeling is huge for that too. So my last big idea here, right, is that if we center the idea of motivating students as language learners as sort of one of our jobs in the classroom, then that really changes a lot of how we approach a lot of things in the classroom, right? It's easy to kind of lament how disengaged or unmotivated students are, or we sort of say, oh, you know, they're only here for the language requirement, right? Or they're here because they have to be. And it's easy to kind of have this fatalist sense of what kind of engagement you're going to get from students because of what their presumed motivations are, right? Because they're only here because they have to be, or they don't like school, or these kinds of things. But if we really think about creating motivation as one of our tasks, we can, I'm not saying we're going to be able to motivate every student to, you know, be intrinsically motivated to learn languages, but I think we can impact student motivation with what we do in class, and we can do things that create motivation for students. And of course, we all know that relationships, respect, trust, right? That students are not going to be motivated if they don't have a positive relationship with us as an instructor. So, you know, we know that as teachers, right? Knowing our students, you know, you said the firm, fair, friendly, flexible, right? These kinds of demeanors and interactions with students where we're communicating that we're invested in their learning, that we respect them as people, that we care about them as people and not just students. Of course, that's sort of baseline, right, for motivation. But there's some other things we can do too, right? If you kind of go back to the sports metaphor and you think like a coach rather than a teacher a little bit, sort of shift your mindset. In the folder is a great article from Linda Ignatz, who is a former actual teacher of the year, but now the director of the Global Seal of Biliteracy. So you might have heard Linda talk at a conference about the Seal of Biliteracy. But it's a great article from España about this metaphor of coaching students. The title of the article is Envisioning the Win, right? What do coaches do, and how do coaches think about their work different than teachers do, right? And to start to get around that idea of thinking like a coach. So in the folder is that article, which I think is outstanding for kind of digging into that idea of thinking like a coach. And also a couple of documents, Actuals Proficiency Targets in the Workplace, and this awesome career ready graphic that I have a really small version of right here, made by ASU's language department, about different careers and areas that require languages or that might involve languages, or where languages might enrich, because I think that's something useful here. But first off, sort of understanding what students' motivations are and goals are really interesting. As adults, I think we tend to project some instrumental motivations, like you're going to need this in your career, or preparing you for college, or help you earn more money when you're bilingual. And I could tell you, really interesting from a research project that actually Dr. Jacobs and I are involved in. We've interviewed some students who are recipients of the Seal of Biliteracy, and understanding their motivations to continue to study languages. A lot of them have motivations that are really much more integrative than they are instrumental. Like they understand language learning as something about understanding the richness of the human experience, right? Of being able to understand other cultures, connect with other people, potentially connect with people in their community, help people, that their motivations and goals are often different than the instrumental motivations that we project onto students. And so getting to know and understanding that those integrative motivations are really appealing to students too, right? Another way we motivate students is obviously having content tied to their interests. So as we learn to know what students are into, we can use that to motivate them, right? We can use art, we can use music, we can use food, we can use celebrities, right? These kinds of things that tie into what students are interested in or what students know about. But I think even more important than that, right, is setting realistic expectations for learning and sort of celebrate them, right? If we're thinking like a coach, we're saying, you know, what do these students need right now to move to the next level? And we want to praise their effort and their achievement when they do it, right? That gradual growth over time where we can point to students and say, before you couldn't do this, and look, now you can, right? And isn't that amazing? And then projecting forward, right? After we do this, you'll be able to do that. And after you do this, then you'll be able to do that. And kind of looking down the road, right, into the future, what you might be able to do if you keep going, that we're looking at not just that future goal, but at the next step. And I think some of the ways we can really show students connecting to that integrative motivation is how they can use the target language in the community, whether that's in the real physical community around us or in the virtual community, connecting students with communities in the virtual world or accessing media or groups in the target language, showing them how they can access this music, right, that maybe they like, or how they can find, you know, these interesting places they could go where I can connect with the target language. There's a lot of different ways we can understand the motivation and goals in students, and it really depends on who your students are. Inviting former or older students can to talk about their language learning experiences. I mean, anybody who's recruited students for study abroad, Tim, for example, will know that former students are kind of students who have participated are the best ambassadors for those kinds of things. And so to have students come back and say, I continued with my language learning and this is what I was able to do because of it, can really help too. But I encourage you to read that article from Linda Ignatz about thinking like a coach. And really, Crystal just anticipated here, right, that helping students envision those goals through proficiency-based rubrics, doing self-reflection and goal setting is huge for that, right? That looking at the proficiency, you know, looking at the proficiency target and saying, what am I going to be able to do? And then to look after their performance, how well did I do? What do I still need to work on? Teaching students to understand how that incremental process of language learning works and making them self-reflected learners has been shown absolutely to motivate students. I have my little magic wand there. It is kind of magical when students get good at it. There's an example in the folder of a self-reflection document. It just has a rubric that I've used with students and some example questions that you could ask students as a part of an assessment after they've completed the performance for an assessment, to ask some questions about self-reflection, how they think they did, right? What to evaluate their own performance and to think about what they did to prepare or what they do differently. The last couple things I'm going to talk about here is giving better feedback as a way to produce motivation, because we know that feedback is a part of creating a positive relationship with the student to the language and informing them, right, to improve their performance. We want successful performances, right? And feedback is a part of that. If we think of giving feedback like a coach, we might shift our feedback practices a little bit, right? We might focus on one area at a time rather than saying, all of these things we're working on. We might say the most important or targeted area, right? The most important thing we can do to improve right now is this, and focusing the feedback on that. We might focus our feedback on our targeted structures or skills. Like, what are we actually working on right now, right? What's the learning target? And focusing my feedback on those structures or skills. If students turn in a piece of writing, I don't need to comment on every error, right? If what we're working on is using the past tense, focus my feedback on their use of the past tense and kind of let the other things go for right now, right? And we want to praise students for unsuccessful attempts that are reaching for the next level, so that we're not always seeing all errors the same, right? That we're seeing errors where students are reaching to try to do something that they may not quite be capable of at their proficiency level, to understand that error is developmental and we don't have to correct it, but we can praise students for attempting, right, to use structures that they're not quite at their proficiency level with. So we use the feedback to motivate rather than to discourage. Most of the sort of research around feedback says that it needs to be sort of timely, right? If we want students to uptake feedback, they need to get it at the right moment and they need to be able to immediately put it into practice. And so what that means is individual feedback on written documents that I can't return for another week or until after the unit of study is already over is probably not a very efficient or effective way to give feedback, right? Feedback that I can get to students right away and that they can immediately use on a new performance is the one that I should spend my time doing. So that means in creating drafting opportunities where students can do an initial attempt, get feedback, and then do a final attempt. That's a really good use of feedback because students can get it when they need it and use it in the final performance. Often, it's much more efficient, timely, and effective to give whole or small group feedback instead of individual feedback. Students turn in some work, or I listen to students' gallery presentations, or I listen to students speaking. I can say, I get a sense of what's something all of us need feedback about, right? Or a large number of students need feedback about. And instead of giving written feedback to individual students or conferencing with individual students, I instead can do a reteach, right? Or a new mini lesson for the whole class to say, look, everybody, I saw in the exercise that we did yesterday or in the practice that we were doing that we all were struggling to make compound sentences, right? Let's look at this and let's do it again, right? And that time you spend doing that reteaching is going to be infinitely more effective than correcting student papers, right? And hopefully we all kind of know that, right? That unless students are going to be asked to redo that assignment, incorporating the feedback, they kind of just take a look at the score and, and in the trash. So thinking about how we use our time to give feedback and giving feedback in a way that supports successful performance. So we're always saying, this is what you've done well, and this is what we need to work on, right? Both of those things at the same time. But really spending less time giving individual feedback and spending more time giving targeted and timely whole or small group feedback will make a big difference in getting more feedback and better feedback to students, which really can improve motivation. Oh, how did I get back here? Very last thing I'm going to say, and then we'll do questions and Crystal can facilitate that, is that sadly but truly, grades are they have a huge role to play in terms of impacting student motivation. And we really can crush and discourage students with grading practices that make them feel unsuccessful. So there's lots of different philosophies and systems for grading students. We know there's a difference between grading and assessment, and that assessment is for the purpose of improving instruction, to giving feedback to improving teaching and learning, and grading is about assigning a grade, right? Not quite the same thing. But if we sort of try to make our grading system more about learning and less about points, the better that's going to work for student motivation, right? So where we try to make we try to make opportunities where we can give feedback about the learning without focusing on the points. So this looks like things where we don't correct, where we don't give back a paper that says, 14 out of 20. which is sort of a meaningless thing and kind of encourages students to focus on points, where we might say something like almost meets expectations, right? Redo this part, right? That's feedback or assessment focused on learning. When we can give feedback on a rubric that says, these are the areas in which you have met expectations, and this is the area where you are not quite yet meeting expectations, with no numerical score on that rubric, right? We can encourage students to attend to the actual feedback. Another sort of thought, there's lots of great ideas around assessment and grading, but to think about how we deal with things like missing assignments, how we deal with opportunities to reassess or re-perform when students haven't met expectations. If we think about employing practices that are designed to motivate rather than discourage students, don't want students to look at a grade book and feel like it's impossible to come back from this, right? So putting lots of zeros in the grade book for a student who has been absent to scare them may have an unintended effect of discouraging students, right? And leading them to give up. So sort of thinking carefully about how, when we have to communicate things like really poor performance to students, right? Or missing assignments or things that they need to redo, how can we do that in ways that encourage students to put forth the effort to give the successful performance instead of communicating the sort of futility of that, right? And there's lots of different ways you can do that depending on the age of your learners and the grading system with which you work. But just sort of keeping present the power that grades have to impact motivation for students and to take the focus off the points in the way that we communicate, even if we don't have the ability to change the way our grade book is set up. For example, the need to award points is there. But if we can move the nature of the feedback into more descriptive terms and away from those points, and sort of moving away from the zeros and the Fs and into language that's about what we need to do to improve or what we're doing well, that's going to contribute to student motivation as well. And at the beginning of the year, you have the opportunity to set up some of those structures and some of those routines and help students understand that the feedback is about the learning and not about the grade, if that makes sense. Okay, that's what I've got for you. What do you want to talk about with our last little bit here?
Do we have any questions? Yeah, I get to know Dr. Eckerson long time ago. And I still remember when I was a graduate student, I supervised student teaching, and she was their cooperating teacher. I was amazed by how their positive dynamics in her classroom, and I really enjoyed. It's like enjoy a show. I have to say, it's really nice. And your teachers believe, your student teachers actually believe you can walk on the water.
Well, I don't know about that, but all of these things you learn, right, over time too. That some of the practices of teaching you also learn by sort of doing it in less successful ways, shall we say, and then saying, wow, that really didn't work very well, or I just don't like the dynamic that I have here. And that's something that I often talk about with student teachers. My husband's a teacher too, and we talk about it, that sadly, really the only thing that you can change when things aren't going well is what you're doing, right? Because you can't make students do anything. They're their own people, and they do responding to their own sort of motivations and interests, but I can try to shape those with what I do. The only thing I can do is change what I do to change the culture, because I can't control individual students. They are who they are. And I have to teach the students I have and not the students I wish I had. And so what can I do, for those students by changing what I'm doing?
Yeah. it's, yeah, I have a chance to work with all your several of your student teachers, and they are really amazed by how your modeling and your demonstrate and your feedback for them. Yeah, it's really helpful. Thank you so much for the great presentation. I already have teachers asking, do we have playback? Yeah.
Well, and I'm happy to, I think I have on this last slide, I can go, like, there's my email address. I am always happy to sort of talk with anybody. If you were like, I tried this and it didn't work, or wait, you won't believe I did this, or if you want to say like, I did this and it was great, or something like that. I would love to hear about that too. So I'm always happy to like keep the conversation going if you want to reach out and talk about this later after you've thought about it.
Yeah, a lot of times as teachers, I remember when I get started, it's like, okay, this doesn't work and I just forget about it. No, sometimes we make some minor changes. We have discussion with colleagues and we ask questions, and we can make it work next time. Yeah. So yeah, I thank you for sharing your email. And also, I really want to invite all teachers to unmute yourself and just ask questions. If you have questions, and Janet's right here. And also, if you want to send her email, or I can help as well. I can help you contact her as well. Any questions? I'm going to share the NDE website that will have all the recordings of our webinar.
Wonderful, because there have been some other ones that I haven't been able to attend that I would love to see from your spring series. So
yeah, it is there. And I know it normally takes me like a week to, I have to say, export the webinar, the recording from NDE, internal website to their open resources website, to YouTube or to something else. It's just a long process. So I need approximately 2 days to a week, depending on how busy people are, to help me.
well, thank you everybody for like taking a part of your Saturday morning to do this. Yes, I was groaning. I was like, why did I say I would do this on a Saturday morning? But thank you, Crystal, so much for organizing it and for everybody who participated. After how tired you probably are after like your first week, or like
Yeah.
my colleague Tim, how busy we've been with meetings and getting things ready to start. We start on Monday. I know everybody is so busy at this time, so thanks so much for coming.
Thank you for take the time to preparing for it, and to teach it. I really appreciate that. I know how busy you are. Yeah, thank you.
My pleasure. Have a great rest of your weekend, everybody.
Yeah, thank you for coming. And I'm inviting you to participating, attending the following webinars as well. So if you're not here, at the very beginning of the webinar, in here are the information about, okay, I'm going to share my screen one more time, just a minute. Okay. So this is the next webinar by Miss Zhe Feng. Okay, her webinar is the same time next August 27th, next Saturday. So the registration link is shared online, and also I'm putting in the chat so that everybody who is interested can come as well. So I do not have time to change the title. Is actually assessment as part of learning process. So here is the registration link in the chat. Thank you very much.
And I'm going to quickly put the link to the Nebraska International Language Association conference. If you didn't know, registration is open. I would love to see some people in person for awesome sessions at the Nebraska International Language Association conference in October. So good to see some of you virtually today too. So
Thank you.
hasta luego. Thanks, Crystal. We'll be in touch.
Let's be in touch. Thank you, everybody. Enjoy rest of your weekend. Thanks. Bye.